A respected national reporter just said out loud what half the football world has been thinking since January. Starting Deshaun Watson in Cleveland this season would be, in his exact words, embarrassing. Not disappointing, not questionable, embarrassing. And the uncomfortable truth is that when you actually sit down and look at everything happening in Berea right now, the practice footage, the content strategy, the quarterback room dynamics, the broader NFL landscape, it's getting harder and harder to find a serious argument against him. This isn't just another slow training camp news cycle story getting blown out of proportion. What's unfolding in Cleveland right now has genuine stakes attached to it, franchise-altering stakes. And the window to get this decision right is closing faster than this front office seems to realize. So let's break down everything, from what's actually happening on the practice field, to what the Browns' own social media accounts are quietly signaling, to why a growing chorus of national voices is saying this Watson situation has already run its course, whether Cleveland wants to admit it or not. There's something genuinely different about the energy surrounding this quarterback competition compared to what Cleveland fans sat through last season. And it's not just the names involved, it's the tone. Because from everything coming out of Berea in these early days of camp, the dynamic between Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson appears to be something you almost never see in a high-stakes quarterback battle. Genuinely respectful. Two players competing hard for the same job, without the political maneuvering, without the veiled shots, without the undercurrent of manufactured tension that can quietly poison an entire quarterback room if left unchecked. Anyone who followed last season closely knows exactly why that contrast matters. The dynamic between Sanders and Dillon Gabriel carried a very different energy. There were moments, subtle but noticeable, where Gabriel's comments felt less like competitive confidence and more like carefully aimed little digs wrapped in plausible deniability. That kind of friction doesn't stay contained between two quarterbacks, it bleeds outward. Receivers start reading the room, offensive linemen pick up on tension, coordinators have to manage personalities alongside game planning. It creates drag on an entire offense at exactly the moment when everyone should be pulling in the same direction. What's happening now feels different, and that actually matters beyond just the feel-good storyline. Here's the psychology behind it that doesn't get discussed enough. When a quarterback is burning mental energy on political self-preservation, watching his back, managing perceptions, guarding information, that's energy that isn't going toward actual improvement. When the competition is clean and respectful, both players can pour everything into developing their own game, learning from each other's strengths, and giving the coaching staff the clearest possible read on who's actually the better option. A respectful competition doesn't just make for better locker room chemistry, it produces more accurate evaluation, and right now, that's exactly what Cleveland needs. Here's something worth paying close attention to that isn't getting nearly enough discussion in the mainstream coverage. The Browns' own official social media accounts have been publishing a significant volume of training camp content, and a disproportionate amount of it has been focused specifically on Shedeur Sanders, his reps, his timing with receivers, his command of the offense. The clips keep coming, and they keep featuring him. Now, some people will look at that and say it's just good content strategy. Shedeur is the more marketable story right now, so of course they're leaning into him for engagement, and that's partially true. But it misses something important about how organizations actually operate during sensitive quarterback battles. Every single piece of content that goes out on an NFL team's official channels during an active QB battle gets reviewed, approved, deliberated over. These aren't random editorial decisions made by a junior social media coordinator flying blind. The choice of who to feature, how often, and in what context reflects genuine internal sentiment, whether that's coming directly from the coaching staff, from the front office, or from an organic recognition that belief in one player is quietly building in ways the organization isn't ready to say publicly yet. When a team's own accounts consistently showcase one player disproportionately during a competition that's supposedly wide open, they're telling you something. They may not be saying it in a press conference. Todd Monken isn't standing in a podium handing out the starting job, but the content doesn't lie in the same way that carefully managed public messaging does. And right now, Everything Cleveland is choosing to put out there points in a pretty clear direction, one that happens to align with what a lot of outside observers have been arguing for months.
Frank Schwab of Yahoo Sports didn't ease into his take. He didn't hedge it with qualifications or bury his actual opinion underneath layers of journalistic balance. He came out directly and called the prospect of Cleveland starting Deshaun Watson this season what he genuinely believes it would be, an embarrassing decision. And then he laid out exactly why in terms that are difficult to dismiss. His core argument starts with something called the sunk cost fallacy, and it's worth breaking this down properly because it applies to football franchises just as powerfully as it applies to individual decision-making in everyday life. Sunk cost refers to resources that have already been spent and cannot be recovered, regardless of what decision you make next. In Cleveland's case, that means the multiple first-round picks surrendered to acquire Watson and the enormous guaranteed money already paid out on that contract. Every single dollar of that guaranteed money has already left the building. Every single one of those draft picks has already been cashed in by another franchise. None of it, not 1 cent, not one pick, comes back whether Watson throws a touchdown pass in Week 1 or never takes another snap for this organization again. The mistake that teams make across every sport, not just football, is treating those already spent resources as a reason to keep making decisions that don't actually serve the team's current best interests. It feels psychologically uncomfortable to walk away from a massive investment because walking away feels like formally admitting the original decision was wrong. But the most disciplined, most successful organizations understand something critical. Past spending has zero bearing on current decision-making. The only question that should actually matter is brutally simple. Which quarterback on this roster gives Cleveland the best realistic chance to win football games this season? Schwab's answer to that question was completely unambiguous. Not Watson. Not even close. He said he would rather see Shedeur Sanders get the start. He would rather see Dillon Gabriel get the start. He mentioned Tyler Green as a preferable option. He went as far as saying he would rather see essentially anyone pulled off the street get the start over continuing to prioritize a quarterback who, by any honest evaluation of what's been on tape over the past several seasons, simply has not looked like a functional NFL starter. His closing message wasn't subtle. It's time for Cleveland to fully abandon whatever remaining hope they're clinging to about a Watson turnaround, because the evidence available suggests that turnaround simply isn't coming. Now, to be fair, there is a counter-argument worth presenting here, because not acknowledging it would be intellectually dishonest. There are people inside that building, reasonable, experienced football minds, who might still genuinely believe there's untapped value left to recover from this investment. The argument goes something like this. Watson has never operated within this specific coaching staff's offensive system. New schemes can sometimes unlock things in veteran quarterbacks that previous systems didn't fit. He's further removed from his surgery timeline now. Maybe a fully healthy Watson in a better designed offensive environment looks meaningfully different than the player who struggled through limited appearances over the past couple of seasons. That argument exists. It isn't completely without logic, but here's where it falls apart under real scrutiny. The improvement narrative has been the primary justification for giving Watson another opportunity for 2 consecutive off-seasons now. At some point, continued patience in the absence of on-field evidence stops being optimism and starts being something closer to institutional denial. The tape hasn't supported the optimism, the performances haven't supported the narrative, and meanwhile, the player sitting right there in the same quarterback room has been demonstrating, whenever given the opportunity, exactly the kind of football that suggests a genuinely different ceiling. The counterargument ultimately asks Cleveland fans and decision-makers to bet on a version of Watson that hasn't shown up yet over a version of Sanders that already has, and that's a wager that gets harder to justify with every passing week of camp. Here's the theory that nobody in official NFL media wants to fully commit to saying, but that Schwab was clearly dancing around, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as conspiratorial. Teams that appear to be prioritizing a clearly struggling veteran over a more promising young player aren't always doing it purely out of misplaced loyalty or sunk cost thinking. Sometimes the incentive structure quietly points somewhere else entirely.
If next year's draft class is expected to feature strong quarterback talent or other premium position value at the top of the board, there is at least a coherent logical argument for why an organization might, without ever publicly admitting it, quietly prefer a scenario where the current season doesn't go particularly well. High draft position has real value, sometimes more value depending on who's available, than a marginal improvement in win total for a team that isn't genuinely competing for a championship regardless of which quarterback is under center.
Nobody in that Cleveland building is going to stand in front of a camera and acknowledge that calculation, even if it exists. No front office in professional sports ever does. But Schwab raised the question directly. Why exactly is this organization apparently laying the groundwork for Watson to open as the starter, given everything already collectively known about his recent performance and his off-field history? What is the strategic point? Unless the answer involves something other than maximizing wins this season, the logic becomes genuinely difficult to follow. It's worth watching carefully as the season unfolds, whether the decisions being made in Cleveland reflect a genuine belief in Watson's ability to turn things around, or something that looks a lot more like a quietly managed rebuilding strategy dressed up in competition language. Let's talk about leverage, because this is the angle that doesn't get nearly enough serious attention when people discuss Shedeur Sanders' future with this franchise. Every time Shedeur performs well, whether that's as the clear starter, as a player getting limited opportunities in a backup role, or even just in training camp and preseason, his value across the entire league goes up. Teams around the NFL are watching. They're evaluating. And the longer Cleveland leaves this situation unresolved, the more that dynamic starts working against their own long-term interests. Think about what an unresolved quarterback competition for a second consecutive year actually communicates to a player with genuine star potential and genuine trade value. It says, this organization still isn't sure you're their guy. It says, we're still hedging. It says, someone else, a player with a significantly longer track record of underperformance, still commands more organizational priority than you do after everything you've shown us. At some point, for any player with real options, and Shedeur Sanders has real options, growing ones, self-preservation and career trajectory have to factor into the equation. Here's the part Cleveland's front office should be losing sleep over. The longer they delay fully committing to Sanders, the more attractive he becomes as an acquisition target for other franchises. His rookie contract situation isn't going to stay in Cleveland's favor indefinitely. Trade leverage has a shelf life, and the franchises lining up to give him a genuine opportunity, the kind of full organizational commitment that Cleveland has so far been unwilling to make, aren't going to stop watching just because the Browns haven't officially made a decision yet. Every week of continued uncertainty is essentially a week of free advertising for what Shedeur Sanders looks like when given real opportunities. Cleveland is running that advertisement for the benefit of every other front office in the league, while simultaneously delaying the decision that would actually let them benefit from it themselves. History across this league tells a remarkably consistent story about how these crossroads situations tend to play out. Every time a franchise faced a genuinely open competition between an established, heavily compensated veteran and a clearly promising younger option, the organizations that made the harder, less financially comfortable decision in favor of upside and long-term value almost always came out ahead. Not immediately, not without short-term discomfort, but over the arc of several seasons, the teams willing to absorb the awkwardness of formally moving on from a big investment while that investment still had time left on the contract consistently built more sustainable success around the younger player they trusted earlier. The cautionary tales are just as instructive. Franchises that clung to declining or clearly underperforming veterans purely because of what had already been committed, because admitting the mistake felt too costly, too embarrassing, too public, paid for that reluctance twice. First, with a bad season that the struggling veteran's presence made inevitable. Then, with the eventual roster reset that had to happen anyway, just from a weaker position, with less leverage, and with additional developmental time already lost for the younger player they should have committed to earlier. Cleveland is standing directly at that crossroads right now. This isn't a situation without historical precedent or useful comparison point.
Organizations have faced remarkably similar decisions before, and the pattern of outcomes is consistent enough that it should carry real weight in that front office's deliberations. The sooner the harder but ultimately correct decision gets made, the better the long-term outcome tends to look. Every additional week of delay doesn't improve the underlying reality of the situation, it just pushes the eventual reckoning further down the road while accumulating opportunity cost in the meantime. Lost development time for Sanders, continued uncertainty for the rest of the roster, and diminished trade leverage the longer every other front office in the league watches this play out in real time. Forget the press conferences, forget the carefully worded statements about competition and earning the job and trusting the process. Those are managed messages designed to keep both players motivated and both fan bases engaged, and they'll tell you almost nothing about where this decision is actually heading. If you want the real signal, there's only one place to find it.
Watch the reps. Watch the preseason snap counts. Watch which quarterback is operating with the first-team offense as those preseason games kick off. And watch whether that changes as camp progresses and the regular season approaches. Practice rep distribution and preseason playing time are the places where a coaching staff reveals its genuine evaluation through action rather than through words. You cannot spin a snap count. You cannot manage the message when the play-by-play of a preseason game is going out in real time. Those numbers reflect actual belief. If Shedeur Sanders starts pulling ahead in first-team reps as camp moves forward, or if he earns a disproportionate share of playing time once those preseason games actually start, that tells you everything the press conferences are carefully designed not to tell you. Conversely, if Watson continues commanding the majority of first-team work all the way through the final preseason game, this coaching staff has almost certainly already made their decision internally, regardless of how much external pressure continues to build. The snap counts will be the truth. Everything else is theater. Spencer Fana working alongside the starters in recent practice footage is worth noting separately, because that's a player with real upside in a draft selection that looks better with every passing day of camp. The pieces around this offense are genuinely interesting, which makes it all the more frustrating that the question of who's directing it from under center remains deliberately unresolved at this late stage of the offseason. Here's the thing that actually gets lost in all the justified frustrations surrounding this situation. And it's worth acknowledging before wrapping up, because it reframes the whole picture. The sheer volume of serious national attention this quarterback conversation is generating is itself a sign of something real. A debate this heated, this widely covered, this actively argued by respected voices across the full spectrum of football media only exists when there are genuine stakes and genuine talent involved on both sides of the equation. Think about where Cleveland's quarterback conversation was just a few years ago. It wasn't heated debate about which talented option deserved the starting role. It was damage control. It was managed expectations. It was the quiet desperation of a fan base trying to find reasons for optimism in a situation that offered very few. The fact that the current conversation, even with all its frustration and unresolved tension, centers on a genuine competition between two players who command real national attention is progress. Uncomfortable progress, but progress. Whatever direction this front office ultimately chooses, the intensity of the debate surrounding that choice reflects something this franchise hasn't always been able to say, that the decision actually matters. That there's real consequence attached to getting it right, that Cleveland's quarterback situation is a genuine storyline rather than a punchline. The pressure to make the right call isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's going to intensify as every preseason snap gets analyzed and every rep distribution gets scrutinized. In a growing chorus of national voices, Frank Schwab, being only the most recent and the most direct, is making one thing increasingly clear. The window to get this right on Cleveland's own terms, while maximum leverage and maximum long-term benefit are still fully available, is not going to stay open indefinitely. The clock is running, and in Berea, every single day that passes without a real answer is a day that answer gets a little more expensive to deliver.